Picture yourself walking through the cold, echoing corridors of the Royal Alcázar of Madrid in 1665. You are a foreign ambassador, educated, worldly, accustomed to the ceremonies of European courts. You have met kings before, tall, imposing figures draped in velvet and authority, but nothing prepares you for what awaits at the end of that hallway. The chamber doors open, and instead of the dignified monarch you expected, you see a figure that jerks your breath away. Charles, Prince of Asturias, the future Charles II of Spain, stands before you, unable to close his mouth. His jaw hangs permanently open like a loose hinge, drool glistening at the corner of his lips. When he attempts to speak, only a wet, strangled sound emerges. His body is shockingly small, frail, unsteady, like a child struggling to support himself on adult-sized robes. You do not sleep that night. Many ambassadors who met him would later write the same. To the citizens of Madrid, he already has a whispering nickname, El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. But even they dare not say it too loudly. The Spanish Empire is still one of the largest on earth, and the Habsburg family that rules it has long been believed to carry a divine mandate. To insult a Habsburg monarch is to question God's chosen order. Yet everyone can see what the court refuses to admit. Something is terribly, unnaturally wrong. The truth is not sorcery. The truth is far more terrifying, because Charles II is not cursed by demons. He is cursed by his own bloodline. For more than 2 centuries, the Habsburgs have fused political ambition with biological hubris. Their empire stretches across continents: Spain, the Netherlands, the Philippines, parts of Italy, and the Americas. In their minds, their blood is not merely noble, it is sacred. The royal body becomes a political instrument, a vessel meant to preserve the dynasty's purity at all costs. And so they marry cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces. Sometimes, the same ancestor appears twice, 3 times, 4 times within a single lineage. Their family tree becomes a looping, tangled web where the same names repeat like a haunting refrain. This is not ignorance. By the 1500s, physicians were already warning about the dangers of closed blood, noting the miscarriages, the stillbirths, the sickly infants. But the Habsburgs dismissed these concerns with grim determination. Better a weak Habsburg than a strong outsider. Charles II becomes the final product of this genetic spiral. Modern geneticists would one day calculate his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, higher than that of a child born to full siblings. In simpler terms, Charles had less genetic diversity than almost any monarch in European history. He should never have existed in the form he did, yet here he was, born into the cradle of the world's mightiest Catholic empire. His ancestry folds in on itself like a collapsing star. The same great-grandparents appear multiple times. His relative Anna of Austria becomes, through the labyrinth of intermarriage, his aunt, grandmother, and great-grandmother. The great Philip II appears in his lineage as grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather all at once. The family calls this tradition purity. History calls it catastrophe. When Charles is born on the 6th of November 1661, the midwives fall silent. They hide their expressions, but their eyes betray horror. His head is far too large, his limbs too weak, his features alarmingly distorted. The deformity that would later be known worldwide as the Habsburg jaw is already painfully visible, his mouth gaping, his tongue too thick for speech, his face shaped by a jaw so misaligned it seems almost unreal. There are no celebratory bells, no joyous proclamations, only whispered prayers. The royal family moves quickly. Portraits of the infant prince that reveal too much are destroyed. Doctors who speak honestly are dismissed or forced into silence. An official declaration is issued insisting the boy is healthy, strong, destined for greatness. But throughout the palace, fear grows. The servants who approach his cradle make the sign of the cross. Some believe the child is bewitched, others that he is a bad omen. Mothers forbid their children from entering his chambers. Even the wet nurses refuse to stay, horrified by his constant choking and gasping for air as his oversized tongue slips backward during sleep. Outside the palace walls, Spain itself is unraveling. The empire is overextended, exhausted by war and economic decline. Famine and plague strike regions that once fed the monarchy. Superstition spreads like wildfire. In this world, a malformed royal child becomes the perfect vessel for anxiety, rumor, fear. The dynasty cannot afford weakness, and so, Charles's childhood becomes a carefully engineered illusion. He cannot hold his head up until age 6. He cannot walk until age 8. He cannot speak clearly until age 10. Each milestone becomes a monumental struggle. His tutors describe his mind as a broken vessel, a heartbreaking metaphor for a boy trying desperately to be what the world demands of him. And in his eyes, witnesses say, there is a tragic, quiet awareness. He knows he is not like other children. He knows he is feared. Court painters are summoned to record his likeness, but even the most skilled hands cannot hide the truth. When the artist Juan Carreño de Miranda first sees the prince, he reportedly recoils. The letters he writes afterwards speak of nightmares, of a child more beast than boy. And yet even he must produce a flattering portrait, carefully smoothing the sharp angles of the jaw, softening the bulging eyes. But portraits cannot change nature. The world sees what it sees. A foreign ambassador brings his young son to meet the prince. The child takes one look at Charles and screams, "Monstruo! Monster!" The incident nearly becomes a diplomatic scandal, but it leaves a deeper wound on Charles himself, a wound no one acknowledges. Behind the scenes, the royal household frays under tension. Servants draw lots to decide who must care for the prince at night. Guards speak in hushed tones of eerie noises coming from his chambers, something between a cry and a groan, as if his malformed body cannot rest even in sleep. Spain continues its downward slide, but the court refuses to connect the empire's fragility with the physical state of its future king. Instead, they cling to rituals, ceremonies, and illusions of grandeur. Whenever a foreign dignitary visits, Charles is positioned behind specially constructed furniture to hide his deformities. His food is pre-mashed, so he will not choke during banquets. His clothes are tailored to disguise his hunched frame. The effect is tragic, grotesque, and heartbreaking all at once. A child trapped behind layers of silk and ceremony, expected to embody an empire he can scarcely understand. This is where the story of Charles II truly begins, not in witchcraft or curses, but in the quiet, relentless consequence of a dynasty that believed itself invincible. A child who should have been protected becomes instead the symbol of a family's greatest mistake, and the empire that once conquered half the world places its fate in the hands of a boy who can barely lift his own head. Charles II's earliest memories were not of toys or lessons or the reassuring presence of a loving family. They were of doctors, dozens of them hovering over his crib with furrowed brows, speaking in hushed tones, making notes they would later be ordered to burn. They measured his head, which grew disproportionately large. They inspected his eyes, which seemed to drift too far apart. They watched him twitch in his sleep, his airway obstructed by a jaw that refused to align with the rest of his face. Nothing about his development followed the rhythm of a normal childhood. By age 2, most children babble words. Charles simply emitted incoherent sounds. By age 3, most run. Charles remained limp as a rag doll. By age 6, he finally managed to hold his head upright, but only for short moments before fatigue forced it to sink again. The palace covered all of this with the precision of a military operation. Any sign of frailty was buried under layers of protocol and secrecy. The Habsburg court, perhaps the most image-conscious in Europe, understood that their empire's stability depended on how the world perceived the boy who would inherit it. Yet despite the manufactured facade, everyone closest to Charles could feel the truth pressing down on them like a storm cloud. His wet nurses reported that he cried for hours, inconsolable, as if his very bones ached. They whispered that he never slept peacefully, his breathing would catch, his tongue slipping back and briefly suffocating him, forcing them to sit beside him through the night to keep him alive. Some of the nurses eventually refused to return to his cradle, crossing themselves before they left the room. Spain was a deeply religious society, and in the 17th century, physical deformities were often viewed not as medical conditions, but as signs, warnings from God, omens, punishments, even evidence of sorcery. And nothing terrified a royal court more than seeming touched by the unnatural. Rumors began circulating quietly among the servants. The prince is cursed. A spell was cast on the queen during her pregnancy. The child is bewitched. The nickname El Hechizado, the bewitched one, solidified long before he took the throne. The kingdom's religious fervor made everything worse. Priests began interpreting his frequent illnesses as spiritual afflictions. Every fever, every choking episode, every seizure-like trembling was blamed on invisible forces. The court's response was predictable for the era. Instead of seeking real medical solutions, they leaned into ritual holy water, relics, prayers, even early forms of exorcism, all performed in secret to protect the monarchy's dignity. But secrecy only magnified the palace's fear. When Charles was 5, the court ordered his first official portrait. The painter expected to meet a prince. What he saw instead made him hesitate. The boy's lower jaw jutted so dramatically that his lips could not meet. His tongue, enlarged and heavy, pushed forward with every breath. His eyes, wide and anxious, darted around the room, tracking every movement with a mixture of curiosity and fear. His limbs, thin, weak, almost bird-like, dangled uselessly from his body. The painter, Juan Carreño de Miranda, would later confide in a letter that he had nightmares after that first sitting. Yet even in his refined brush strokes, even with every artistic trick used to soften the prince's features, the truth could not be fully concealed. Observers who saw the portrait noted something uncanny about it, as if the artist had struggled to translate a living tragedy into a dignified image. And still, behind closed doors, Charles fought a battlefield no one else could see. His mind developed slowly, unevenly. Tutors reported that he often forgot lessons moments after hearing them. Reading was a challenge. Writing, an ordeal. He became easily overwhelmed, prone to tears and tantrums when expected to perform beyond his ability. There were days he seemed bright and curious, connecting ideas with surprising clarity, and then days when he stared into space, unresponsive, trapped in a fog of confusion. As Charles grew, so did the court's desperation to shield him from the eyes of visiting nobles. Spain's influence was already beginning to fray at the edges, and the appearance of a strong heir was critical to maintaining the illusion of stability. Whenever foreign ambassadors visited, palace attendants choreographed elaborate scenes to hide the worst of Charles's condition. Special furniture concealed his inability to stand for long. Layers of ornate clothing disguised his disproportionate body. Meals were served in small, pre-cut pieces to prevent public choking. These measures created a grotesque kind of theatre designed not for entertainment, but for survival. Yet even the best performances sometimes fail. When Charles was 7, an Italian ambassador visited the court, bringing his young son. The boy took one look at the prince's distorted face and erupted into screams, shouting, "Mostro! Mostro! Monster! Monster!" The boy's father tried to silence him, but the damage was done. Charles froze, stunned by the child's reaction, unable to comprehend why he inspired such terror. The court scrambled to smooth over the incident diplomatically, but the emotional scar it left on Charles was far deeper. Nevertheless, the machinery of illusion pushed onward. Spain needed its heir to look capable, even if he wasn't. The boy learned to pose, to rehearse simple gestures that could be mistaken for princely dignity. But behind the scenes, he remained a prisoner inside a crumbling body. His bones ached constantly. His muscles failed him without warning. His head felt too heavy for his neck. Even walking, something he did not achieve until 8 years old, was more of a slow, uncertain shuffle, relying on walls and furniture for support. And as the child suffered, so too did the kingdom around him. Spain's economy weakened, its colonies strained, its nobles fought for influence, and its enemies watched hungrily for signs of vulnerability. Many whispered that the frail prince symbolized Spain's fate, a once mighty empire now cracking from within. But the Habsburg court refused to admit any weakness. They would maintain the illusion at any cost, even if it meant demanding the impossible from a child already crushed under expectations far beyond his strength. As Charles approached adolescence, one truth became painfully clear. The boy who could not speak clearly was destined to become the king of Europe's largest and most troubled empire. The weight of that future had already begun to twist his spirit as surely as his body. And for Spain, the worst was still yet to come. By the time Charles II reached adulthood, he possessed neither the physical strength nor the intellectual clarity expected of a monarch. Yet Spain, the vast empire creaking under the weight of its own contradictions, needed him desperately. For the Habsburg dynasty, the single most important duty of a king was to produce an heir. Without one, centuries of careful, if catastrophic, dynastic engineering would come crashing down, and so the court prepared for the inevitable, a royal marriage. Europe watched closely. Foreign powers maneuvered, each hoping their princess would become Queen of Spain and wield influence through a king who was, by all accounts, incapable of ruling on his own. Diplomats exchanged letters filled with coded warnings and cautious optimism, debating how much of Charles's condition was rumor and how much was horrifying truth. Eventually, the choice fell on Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess of grace, intelligence, and political value. She was only 17 when she arrived in Madrid, carrying with her French refinement and the hope of bridging the tense rivalry between France and Spain. Her first impression of Charles was devastating. This was not the regal husband she had been promised. This was a man-child, pale and sickly, with eyes that flickered anxiously and a jaw so malformed he could barely speak her name. Yet duty demanded she pretend not to notice. The wedding ceremony proceeded with the usual grandeur, but behind the gilded curtains, the truth quickly collapsed into tragedy. The wedding night was a disaster whispered across Europe. Attendants reported that Marie-Louise left the chamber in tears. Charles, confused and overwhelmed, seemed to have no comprehension of what had gone wrong. Historians now know what the Spanish court refused to admit. Charles suffered from severe hormonal and developmental abnormalities. His reproductive organs were underdeveloped, almost infantile. Physically and biologically, he was incapable of consummating the marriage in any meaningful way. But because he was king, the blame did not fall on him. It fell on the young queen. Marie-Louise was subjected to humiliating examinations by court physicians, old men with cold hands and colder hearts, who searched her body for signs of fault. They made her drink vile herbal concoctions, swallow powders, endure invasive procedures that left her weak and shaken. None of it mattered. The truth was simple. She could not conceive because Charles could not father a child. But Spain needed an heir, and desperation turned to cruelty. The court whispered. The public gossiped. Some nobles accused her of witchcraft. Others claimed she didn't love the king fervently enough to become pregnant. The pressure crushed her spirit. Once bright and warm, Marie-Louise grew pale, anxious, increasingly reclusive. She wrote letters home in trembling script. I am married to a ghost. I cannot explain the sorrow here. I fear I will die young. She was right. At 26, she collapsed after a ride and died suddenly. The official cause was listed as appendicitis. Many suspected otherwise: suicide, poison, or the cumulative effects of years of forced fertility treatments that eroded her health. Spain mourned her, but the court wasted no time searching for a replacement. The kingdom's survival demanded another marriage, another attempt at an heir, another woman to be sacrificed to the same impossible expectations. Charles's second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, arrived under no illusions. Her family boasted extraordinary fertility, 17 children born to her parents, and Spain seized on this as a divine sign. If anyone could give Charles an heir, surely it was she. But Maria Anna quickly discovered what Marie-Louise had suffered in silence. Charles was affectionate but confused, eager for companionship, but physically incapable of intimacy. He often clung to her like a frightened child, seeking comfort rather than partnership. The royal physicians intensified their efforts. Charles was given strange aphrodisiacs, tinctures, and potions meant to awaken the king's vigor. Nothing worked. His body resisted all attempts to function like a normal adult male. As months turned into years without a pregnancy, suspicion turned once again toward the queen. Like her predecessor, Maria Anna endured invasive treatments and relentless pressure. She, however, fought back with political cunning. She blamed rival factions, accused ministers of sabotage, and suggested that dark forces were at work. Her claims found fertile ground in a court drowning in superstition. By this time, Charles's health had deteriorated further. He suffered from chronic illnesses, bleeding gums, epileptic episodes, and periods of terrifying mental fog. His speech slurred into near unintelligibility. At times, he wandered the palace at night, muttering prayers or crying out in confusion. The ministers needed an explanation. The church was ready to provide one. Charles was possessed. At least, that was the official verdict of Father Froilan Diaz, a priest with a flair for drama and a hunger for power. He declared that sorcerers had placed a curse on the king to destroy Spain. Maria Anna, realizing the political usefulness of this claim, supported it eagerly. Thus began one of the most bizarre episodes in royal history: public exorcisms of a living monarch. The first sessions were held in secret, but word quickly spread. Priests forced Charles to drink holy water mixed with ground bone fragments of saints. Each time he vomited, likely due to contaminated water, they proclaimed it proof the demons were resisting eviction. These rituals grew more theatrical, more violent, more desperate. During one exorcism, Charles convulsed so violently that attendants feared he would die. Father Diaz shouted triumphantly that the devil is fleeing the king's flesh. Foreign ambassadors documented the scenes with horror, comparing them to wartime torture. Yet the exorcisms continued, dozens of them, because Charles himself believed in them. His diminished mental capacity made him deeply susceptible to religious manipulation. When priests told him the demons were weakening, he felt a brief, illusory relief. The climax of this hysteria came in 1698, when Father Diaz ordered the palace to be purified. Servants dragged out furniture, personal belongings, and treasured heirlooms objects supposedly tainted by witchcraft, and burned them in towering bonfires while chanting exorcisms. Smoke billowed across Madrid. Citizens whispered that the palace itself might be collapsing, but no amount of holy water could heal the king's broken body. No ritual could restore an heir. No prayer could undo centuries of genetic collapse. Spain was hurtling toward disaster, and everyone, except perhaps Charles himself, could see it. And soon, the final chapter of the Habsburg dynasty would begin. By the final years of Charles II's life, the Spanish court had transformed into a place of dread, rumor, and ritual. The king, once the fragile child hidden behind silk curtains, was now a broken man in his mid-30s, his body deteriorating faster than any physician could chart. He moved through the palace like a walking ghost, exhausted by the simple act of breathing, his frame warped by decades of suffering. Spain, too, was collapsing. The once mighty empire, stretched across oceans, now sagged under war debts, famine, foreign pressure, and internal corruption. More than ever, the nation needed the stability of a successor, and yet, the throne remained empty of heirs. Each passing year tightened the inevitable noose. Europe was waiting for Charles to die. His last years were a grim parade of medical crises. He often fainted without warning, his vision blurred, his legs trembled beneath him. Some days, he could barely swallow food. Other days, he suffered from violent stomach attacks that left him bedridden for weeks. His hair, once sparse but present, began falling out in clumps. His skin turned a pale, waxy yellow, clinging tightly to bones that looked as if they belonged to a starving child. Visitors wrote that the king seemed like a man whose soul was too heavy for his body. Even the exorcisms, those dramatic public spectacles that had defined the preceding years, lost their power. Charles began to fear that he would die possessed, or worse, that his soul would be condemned because he had failed God and his kingdom. These anxieties tormented him, worsening his already fragile mental state. Yet his belief in spiritual attacks kept the cycle going. Whenever he felt sudden pain or confusion, he begged the priests to return. They did, dozens more times. Every ritual drained what little strength he had left. Meanwhile, the political factions inside the court turned Charles's suffering into a battleground. Maria Anna, his second wife, fought to maintain her influence, pushing her own relatives as potential heirs to the empire. Opposing nobles, suspicious of her intentions, accused her of manipulating the king's already fragile mind. France pushed for its own candidate. Austria did the same. The question that consumed Europe was simple. Who would inherit Spain when the last Habsburg fell? Because fall he would. Everyone knew it. In 1700, Charles's condition worsened rapidly. Over a few weeks, he lost almost all mobility. His speech, always difficult, became nearly impossible to understand. Witnesses said he spoke as though drowning, each word dragged from a throat that could no longer cooperate. His appetite vanished. Even the mush-like foods prepared specifically for him became too much. His attendants reported something even more disturbing. Charles seemed to age by years in just days. His body shrank, his face sagged, his eyes drifted outward, unfocused. It was as if the decades of suffering contained within his malformed body were finally breaking free all at once. He could no longer rule. He could barely exist. On the 1st of November 1700, at just 38 years old, Charles II died. The court fell into silence. Priests murmured prayers. Servants wiped tears. But beneath the grief was a wave of something else. Fear, because now the real chaos would begin. Before the burial, physicians performed an autopsy, and what they found shocked them so profoundly that they recorded it in unusually explicit detail. His body contained almost no blood. His intestines were described as rotted. His heart was abnormally small. His lungs were malformed. His brain was shrunken, the size of a walnut. One report claimed likely an exaggeration, but one revealing the horror witnesses felt. His testicles were described as black as charcoal, a sign of severe endocrine failure. This was not merely a sick man. This was a man undone from the inside by centuries of deliberate inbreeding. Charles II's death marked the end of the Habsburg line in Spain. With no heir, the question of succession triggered a political avalanche. Two powerful dynasties, Bourbon France and Habsburg Austria, both claimed the throne, and Europe erupted into the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 18th century. Spain, once ruler of territories across the world, became the stage on which other empires battled to carve up its remains. The war reshaped Europe. Borders shifted. Alliances collapsed. New powers rose. And all of it, every death, every ruined city, every burned field, could be traced back to the decision made centuries earlier. The Habsburg obsession with purity over survival. Charles II's life became a symbol, a warning whispered across generations. His twisted jaw, his fragile bones, his tormented mind, these were not signs of demonic influence. They were the inevitable verdict of biology. His body was the final, undeniable judgment on a dynasty that believed itself above the laws of nature. In a bitter twist of irony, the Habsburgs had sought to protect their greatness through genetic isolation. Instead, they engineered their downfall. The purest Habsburg became the least capable. The dynasty that crossed oceans and conquered continents was undone not by enemies and armies, but by its own blood. And Charles, poor, suffering Charles, paid the price. When we see his portraits in museums today, softened by artistic mercy, we are looking at more than a historical figure. We are looking at the physical embodiment of human arrogance, at the biological consequences of political ambition, at the fragile boundary between power and vulnerability. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that no dynasty, no matter how mighty, can escape the forces of evolution, that no empire can redefine the laws of nature, and that the pursuit of purity, biological, ideological, or otherwise, has always ended in ruin. Charles II did not choose his fate, but his story remains one of history's clearest warnings. When power convinces us that we are untouchable, nature will remind us otherwise.